Welcome to episode 6 of our Making Rights Real podcast, which is looking at how human rights standards can help achieve gender equality. And today we're looking at how human rights standards can help in action to end poverty. And I'm delighted to welcome Siobhan Harding from Women's Support Network, who's undertaken extensive research on women's experiences of poverty in Northern Ireland, and Helen Flynn from Just Fair, who's a human rights expert.
Hello.
My name's Jonna Monaghan, Director of Women's Platform, and our role is to connect the women's sector in Northern Ireland to international networks, including UN, and build capacity on human rights standards. Today, we're going to look in particular at the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. The UK was examined under ICESCR, as it is called for short, in early 2025. But first of all, I would like to ask Siobhan, could you tell us a bit about your research and what it shows about women's lives today?
Yes, sure. Along with Ulster University, the Women's Regional Consortium did a big research piece with 250 women across Northern Ireland on the impact of the cost of living crisis on their lives. And the research showed that many women on the lowest incomes were being forced to skip meals. They were being forced to go hungry and cold and really struggling to afford the essentials for themselves and their families. It really found that a lot of women were at crisis points. So after a decade of welfare reform policies, the COVID pandemic and now the cost of living crisis, it has really hit women harder. And that, alongside the issues around budget cuts and lack of funding for essentials such as health and social care, childcare, has really meant that women are being forced to make up for those cuts through unpaid work. And so the cumulative result of all of this is that women are becoming the shock absorbers of poverty in their own homes. So they're going without food, they're going without heat and clothes, just so that they can provide for their children and families and to protect them from the impacts of poverty. The research really showed that the disproportionate harm of the cost of living crisis on women and children. So they shared their experiences with us of being unable to afford like basic things. So we're talking the likes of formula milk, things like healthy food, particularly fruit and vegetables. They're talking about having to go to food banks and living in cold homes, skipping meals, all those sorts of things, as well as the significant toll of the cost of living crisis on their mental health. So really stressed and anxious and worried about making ends meet on low incomes, whether that's through social security or through low paid work. And I suppose it was really summarised in a quote from one of the women who said, we're not living, we're just existing. And so that's really the crux of what the research found.
Those are some really stark findings. Helen, from your rights perspective, what stands out about that for you?
So the first thing that really stands out is the importance of the type of research that Siobhan's doing, and that's talking to people who are experiencing the actual outworkings of these laws, of these policies, of these programmes. And it's key to remember, I always think, that human rights are about what people are experiencing in their everyday lives. So I'm just incredibly grateful that people like Siobhan exist who do that really important research and do the work that she does. Another thing that really stood out for me in what Siobhan has highlighted is the particular impact on women. And as we know, women are a group who are considered to have a protected characteristic, the protected characteristic of gender. And the evidence that Just Fair presented to the UN committee in this review that you had just mentioned, and we had gathered that evidence from lots of civil society groups, that evidence made it clear that the current system is failing specific groups, particularly those with protected characteristics. Those groups face barriers to accessing basic necessities such as healthcare, food, housing, decent work, and social security. The inequalities, though, they are deeply intertwined with those at the sharpest end of inequality, often experiencing violations of multiple rights. And they face them on a repeated basis, whether it's austerity, whether it's the pandemic, whether it's the cost of living crisis that Siobhan just spoke so eloquently about. These groups always experience the deepest impacts time and time again.
That is repeated, I think, across all of our podcasts. Just in relation to the review, what are the key recommendations from the UN for the UK and for Northern Ireland?
So in terms of poverty, I decided we would look at that because this is the longest set of recommendations that this committee has ever provided to the UK, and there's such a huge amount in there. The covenant that we're discussing, as you called it, ISESCR, covers issues like right to work, including just and favourable conditions of work. It covers social security. It covers protection of the family, adequate standard of living, including food, clothing and housing. It covers education. It covers health, a huge list of areas that are impacted negatively by poverty. It's also worth mentioning that the committee has identified 3 priority areas in relation to the UK, and those are areas that need particular focus and attention. And 2 of these relate directly to poverty in the UK. The first one calls for the UK government to conduct an independent assessment of the cumulative impact of austerity measures introduced since 2010 on economic, social and cultural rights, focusing on disadvantaged groups, regional disparities and the effects of subsequent policy shifts. The second of those priority recommendations is on welfare reform, and the committee asks the UK to assess the impact of welfare reforms introduced since 2010 on the most disadvantaged groups, take corrective measures, including reversing policies such as the 2-child limit, the benefit cap, and the 5-week delay for the first universal credit payment. So what we have in those 2 is a call for an assessment of the general impact, but then it zooms in on the most impacted and calls out 3 specific policies that we know have been causing particular hardship: the 2-child limit, the benefit cap, and the 5-week delay for universal credit payment. I think it's really skillful wording personally that encapsulates both the broader picture, but also the impacts on people's actual immediate daily lives. From an advocacy point of view, because I know we all work in advocacy, I find it's really useful that the committee has thought about poverty and its causes in a very broad sense. So there are some specific recommendations on poverty, like the one to end child poverty, including by increasing budget allocations. But poverty is also mainstreamed throughout these recommendations. So to take the example of women, the group that we're here to talk about today, there are recommendations right through these concluding observations that I think deal with the causes of poverty for women. And Siobhan, you please correct me if I'm wrong on this. But we have recommendations that directly mention women in relation to gender responsive budgeting to guarantee women's equal access to employment, social security, healthcare, education and decision-making roles. And that concluding observation talks about women in a really intersectional way, thinking of different characteristics that women have. There's a mention of women's underemployment and unemployment. There's a mention of precarious working conditions for women. There's mention of discrimination in employment and occupation, including sexual harassment. There's mention of equal pay, specifically mandatory pay gap reporting and cross-sectoral job valuation. There's a recommendation on improving availability, accessibility and affordability of childcare. There's one on promoting shared caregiving responsibilities. There's an important concluding observation on multidimensional determinants of poverty and poverty eradication, with particular attention to those disproportionately affected, including female-headed households, and a particular mention of Northern Ireland in that one. And then there's a mention of affordable housing and social housing, including for single mothers. So I think that's a lot, but I think that's some of the main ones that we should be focused on today.
I think it's really important that there is such a strong and extensive set of recommendations. Siobhan, from your perspective, how relevant is this to women in communities, and what would help make these rights actually real in women's lives?
The recommendations are hugely relevant for women in communities because they help women to recognise that living in poverty is a violation of their fundamental rights. It's not their fault. And I think that's, critical to understand all of this. So the human rights standards require a shift from viewing poverty as that kind of personal failure, like it's about you and what you've done or not done, to seeing poverty as a structural issue that state parties have a responsibility to address. And so the standards help to emphasise the rights of those that are living in poverty, including that right to an adequate standard of living, the right to health, education, work, but also the right to participate in decision-making processes that affect their lives. So that human rights approach recognises that poverty is rooted in those systemic inequalities and in discrimination. And so therefore there is a need to address the underlying causes of poverty, including that lack of access to resources and to opportunities that people in poverty often face. and the discriminatory laws and policies that continue to mean that people, live a life of poverty. And in terms of making these rights real, I'm going to borrow from Eleanor Roosevelt, who, as you know, played a key role in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And she talked about where human rights begin. So it's in the small places, it's close to home. That the world of the individual person, where they go to school, where they live, where they work. She said, unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. And so that's critically important in terms of how relevant these rights are to women and communities. And I suppose the rights become real in people's lives when they're there through protection in law, when they're enforced well by authorities and they're recognised and respected in society. And also, crucially, by ensuring that people know what their rights are and that they can exercise them in their daily lives. So it's how they understand those rights and how they can then apply them in their own lives.
That's really eloquently described, particularly the knowing the rights. And you've already started answering this. My final question is, what needs to be done to strengthen rights-based policy making?
I'm not sure I can put it any more succinctly than Siobhan did in talking about at the start the actual research that she does. And it's in those lives behind those closed doors, how people are living. And then that Eleanor Roosevelt quotation, that was incredibly powerful. But in the concluding observation, there is a real focus on evaluation, on clear targets and on enforcement. Now, the inference somebody like me who's a big fan of the concluding observations could draw is that the committee feel they didn't receive this assessment, which they had requested from the UK government during the current reporting round. But this kind of call for the evaluation, for the targets, for the measuring is there throughout the concluding observations. There are repeated requests for this. And it's really, I think, at the root of it, a request for the UK government to stop just for a minute and understand the impact of the work it's doing and to provide the committee with that clear information. And honestly, I really think that's a hugely important point. It's part of that hugely important work that Siobhan is doing, that the government probably should be doing, actually understanding the impact on people's lives from their perspective. It's so hugely important for the government to speak to rights holders, to speak to those who are directly impacted by their decisions, and to involve them thoroughly and genuinely in the decision-making process. I do believe that that kind of work could be transformational to the way we do policy. And in the concluding observations in terms of this evaluation and monitoring, we see it in relation to the multidimensional determinants of poverty. Measurable targets are requested. The UK is asked to assess the impact of their fiscal policy on economic, social and cultural rights. The committee recommends a comprehensive national strategy on the right to food, setting clear time-bound targets and mechanisms to assess progress. The assessment of the impact of welfare reforms introduced since 2010 is requested, as I mentioned, and there's also a request for the evaluation of the impact of existing programmes on the improvement of educational attainment gaps. And then another issue that comes up time and time again in these is what Siobhan spoke about, this idea of rights-based decision-making. So whether it's in relation to an inclusive care system, ending child poverty, or our drugs policy, the committee is calling on the government to make these decisions on the basis of human rights. And I think that's hugely important and a way of hopefully stopping negative decisions from happening in the first place, because you're trying to upstream access to justice. You're trying to make the right decisions in the first place so that the bad consequences don't follow. Now, it is up to us as civil society to take these concluding observations and to hold the UK and to hold the Northern Ireland governments to account and to use them as an extra tool in the really excellent advocacy work that Northern Ireland civil society already does. But there is a missing part of the puzzle, and as the committee noted, we need our own Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland to bring these rights into our own law in Northern Ireland. That's the key, I think, to enabling a lot of what we've just talked about: human rights decision-making, proper evaluation and target setting, bringing rights holders into decision-making. And the Bill of Rights was, of course, something that was envisaged as part of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, but 27 years on, the UK and the Northern Ireland governments have failed to deliver that.
Yeah, I basically want to say what Helen said there, and I'm going to pick up on a few of the points that she made, but really it's that taking a step back and looking at the impacts of poverty. It's so damaging, not only to the people that are impacted, and quite often they're more likely to be women and children, but also damaging to local communities, the economy and our society as a whole, and not to mention the impact on our already stretched public services. It obviously has impacts on health and education. It's therefore really important to be able to address it through that rights-based policy making, and that can be strengthened by, as Helen said, to ensure that people are meaningfully involved in the decisions that affect their lives. So, as I said before, they need to understand what their rights are. They need to be able to access this information in a way that they can understand it, so they know if their rights have been violated and they know what to do to enforce their rights. And they must have that opportunity to participate in the development of policies and practices that affect their lives. And crucially, that must include prioritising the voices of those who are the most marginalised, because their perspectives must be equally heard. And there's also a need for accountability, so that there are mechanisms in place to monitor how people's rights are being affected, and the ability to provide remedies when things go wrong.
That is a really clear call to action, and thank you so much for covering so much ground. I'd like to thank both Siobhan and Helen for your time today. And thank you so much to you all for listening. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.